In today's session, we're going to continue on the series on organizational opportunities, stories and lessons learned from the front lines. Today's story comes to us about a company we were looking to improve organizational productivity. As a manufacturing company, it was a combination of make to order and make to stock. The company was looking to improve its on-time delivery performance, reduce its lead time, and reduce the finished goods inventory. The company had about 75% of the orders stuck in the first third of the production system. So when we looked at all the orders in the system, most of them were stuck in the first 2 or 3 processes. So we analyzed the reason for that. And then what we had to do is we had to change the mindset. And then how do we go about doing this and improving the company's performance? So let's talk about direct labor costs. So what the company was doing was trying to minimize direct labor cost. And what that translated into was creating an artificial bottleneck up early in the process. And that's why a lot of the orders were stuck in the first third of the process. So when we look at cost reduction based on labor savings, a lot of people believe that's going to translate into improved company profitability. And also running all products through the process that has no direct labor that is applied to the product will increase the margin on the product and improve company profitability. So in this case, they had a process where once they set it up, the machine just ran and no operator was needed to attend the machine. So of course, there was no direct labor being applied to that process. And so since there's no direct labor applied to that process, that's reduced labor on the job. And that reduced labor, the belief was that was going to translate into improved company profitability. So that was the mindset. So let's look at cost. So if we can classify costs, we can classify it into basically 3 classifications: fixed cost, variable cost, and mixed cost. So in most organizations, we see fixed cost and variable cost. Let's talk about those 2. So what is fixed cost? So fixed cost doesn't change as volume changes, but changes on a per unit basis as the cost driver increases or decreases within the relevant range. So depending on how many units we sell, fixed cost means within the relevant range, the total cost stays the same regardless of the output from the system. Unlike variable costs, so variable costs change in proportion with the output of the system. So as the outputs increase, the variable cost increases in a linear manner typically. And so a good example of variable cost would be material. So as the number of units sold increases, the more material we need to buy to go into the product. When we look at cost behaviors, there's basically 2 types of cost behaviors, what we call step cost and linear cost. Okay, so step cost behavior means that the cost doesn't change steadily with changes in volume, but rather in a discrete point. So it remains fixed for a short period and then it steps up in cost as the activity increases within the relevant range. So an example of this would be direct labor. So direct labor only increases when we add more direct labor, we hire new people. And it also goes a step down when we lay off people. But in the short term, in the relevant range, when we're not hiring and firing people, the direct labor cost is fixed. Okay, so direct labor acts in a stepwise manner. When we hire people, it goes up in a stepwise fashion. So a step cost is fixed within certain boundaries outside of which it'll change. So we need to understand which costs are variable, which costs are fixed, and then which ones act in a stepwise manner and which ones act in a linear manner. Linear cost behavior is a relationship of costs given over a certain specific relevant range of activity level or in terms of cost driver levels. So a linear cost behavior is represented by a straight line in which cost is assumed to be variable within the relevant range. Okay, so if we understand the 2 different types of cost behaviors, now let's look at direct labor costs. So direct labor costs are fixed and function as a step function in the relevant range. So only when labor is reduced, laying off people, or increasing, hiring people, the cost of the labor changes. If we don't hire people, we don't lay off people, the cost doesn't change. And from the company perspective, it acts in a fixed manner. So reducing time on a process reduces the labor content for the work being completed, but doesn't reduce the overall total labor cost that the company is paying through payroll. So if you don't believe direct labor cost is fixed, take your weekly payroll, plot it out on a graph, and what you're going to see is that it's pretty flat and stable over the short period. So what was the mind shift we need to do? Reducing labor time on a process reduces the labor content for the work being completed, but doesn't reduce the total labor costs or overhead costs that the company is paying to keep the organization functioning. Therefore, reducing time on a process will have no effect on the overall labor or operating costs of the organization. Attempt to reduce labor costs at the job level can create artificial bottlenecks in the flow and reduce overall output. So that's what they saw. They were trying to reduce the labor costs on the job by running everything through this one machine that was running unattended, so we didn't have to apply any labor to it. So that process was cheaper to run across because there's no labor. So by doing this, they created this artificial bottleneck. So what's the mind shift that we need? The way that a reduction in process time will affect the overall company performance is, one, it reduces the constraint operation time, so it focuses on strengthening the weakest link in the chain, or it frees up non-constraint operations. That capacity is transferred to other areas to improve the total output, specifically the constraint. Okay, so we improve the capacity on the internal constraint, or we subordinate the non-constraints to support the overall flow of the constraint. So when we look at utilizations of resources, using protected capacity to create stability, overutilization of protected capacity creates waste and reduces organizational performance. So if we utilize the protected capacity to offload constraint resources and improve organizational performance, we can show increase in output of the organization. So in this case, you can see the performance improvement here. So we started out and we started reducing the work in process. We started focusing on flow, and we saw the number of past due orders come down. And then all of a sudden, about week 51 here, we saw a steady increase. And so that steady increase was due to them trying to run more and more orders through the process that didn't have any direct labor hours associated with it and create a huge bottleneck. So then when we started analyzing it, we said, hey, how can we offload that work? And one of the guys suggested, hey, we can offload this work on these other machines that are used for a different step in the process. And when we did that, we saw a dramatic reduction in late orders and past due orders. So flow increased dramatically. And so what we did end up doing, every day we did a walk and we looked at how much work was piled up in front of this one process, how much work was piled up in other processes downstream, and we made a decision every day how to split our resources to focus on flow. So they had 2 machines in the early step process, 5 machines in the later step process, and every day we looked at the workload and decided how many of those 5 machines do we want to allocate to doing the upstream process. So depending on that workload, we made a decision every day, and having that daily decision to better flex our resources and use our protective capacity, we significantly reduced the late orders, and we saw output go up significantly, lead time come down, profitability increase, and more orders going out on time. And we actually, once we reduced that replenishment cycle for our stock parts, we actually reduced inventory because the replenishment cycle got shorter and shorter in production. So that's our session for today. Again, connect with me on LinkedIn, visit our website, go to our YouTube channel where we have tons of information about mind shift necessary to create a high-performing organization.